Forensic science begins at the end of someone else's story. Scrutinizing a violent moment in time. Samples are collected and preserved. The scene exhaustively photographed. Evidence prepared for forensic experts to examine. Television and movies fuel blind faith in the power of crime scene investigations, or CSI. But since the emergence of DNA analysis, a disturbing trend has emerged. DNA, pulled from evidence that spent decades gathering dust, has revealed a surprising number of wrongful convictions. In fact, in hundreds of exoneration cases, DNA did more than free the innocent. It proved that the forensic evidence that convicted them was wrong. It's time to put CSI on trial to find out what's real science, what has scientific potential, and what's just junk. The stakes couldn't be higher.
My name is Odell Adams, and I was acquitted on the federal side, and on the state side, I was convicted of the same crime.
Hello, 911.
Hello?
Hi, this is 911.
I just saw a shot fired towards me.
Okay, one moment.
Sorry. I'm still shaking right
That's
now.
okay. Take a deep breath and tell me what corner you're at.
162nd and
Here,
Start.
162 and Start. Did you see who shot at you?
I did not.
10:30 p.m. on the night of October 5th, 2018. Gunfire erupts in the parking lot of the Speakeasy Lounge in East Portland, Oregon. A couple of bullets strike an empty sedan. Nobody is injured. Whoever fired the shots flees. Witnesses call 911.
I am standing outside the Speakeasy Lounge. I'm okay. I don't think anyone else is hurt.
Okay.
There was about 5 shots fired.
Okay. And could you see the gun?
I did not, but I saw the muzzle flash.
Okay.
Portland police collect ballistic evidence from the scene.
So there were a scattering of shots.
John Robb is a defense attorney who worked on the case.
Some of them hit the car, some of them hit the bar, some of them, I think, just cleared the roof of the bar and nobody ever found them.
The police investigation turned on this evidence: 10 .40 caliber cartridge casings recovered from the bar's parking lot. It was a Friday night that would change one man's life forever. Odell Adams was at the bar, relaxing after a long week of work at an air conditioning company.
I was working 12-hour shifts, actually, and I was finna be taking time off of my regular schedule to become a welder, like hands-on welding, and it was a good job. I liked it.
He had lived in Portland since childhood, when he, his mother, and 5 siblings moved there from Milwaukee.
As a kid, was very active, super funny.
Sharnisa Secret is Odell Adams' older sister.
He was a very wise kid and very strong and very protective, you know.
But leaving his father and extended family back in Wisconsin hit him hard.
And I think that everything kind of like played a part in my behavior. I think that kind of played a big part in everything when I was growing up and acting out.
I don't want to say he kind of fell through the cracks, but you know, the neighborhood, they had a lot of gang members, I would say, but for the young folk, it was their community.
The community was the community. So all my friends and all that stuff was in this community, which was a high drug area.
Encounters with police became the norm.
And the police didn't care about your age or anything, and they was treating me like a grown-up. I can actually remember a time where officer went in my drawers looking for crack, and I was 12 years old, you know what I'm saying? It became regular for me, okay, here come the cops, okay, well they gonna do this and they gonna do that.
Odell had been caught up in the criminal justice system for a long time. I think he was 13 when he was facing his first charges.
There is so much that was missed back then. And so maybe there were a lot of red flags that my mother didn't see. She's a single parent with 6 kids, doing the best that she can to take care of us.
The neighborhood, the police, it was a cycle Adams couldn't shake.
Once you are on probation, then they just keep extending it, keep extending it, and keeping extending it, and keeping extending it. So then you are like just on probation forever, basically.
By the fall of 2018, when the shooting outside the Speakeasy Lounge took place, he was on supervised release for possession of a firearm and was focused on rebuilding his life and his future. For his family, it was a very difficult time.
My mom had colon cancer and has been fighting colon cancer for a very long time. So my mom was very sick.
While his mother declined, police investigators focused in on security camera footage from the front of the bar. One camera faced north and the other south.
And there's a gap that's between what the 2 cameras show. So there's a portion of the area that simply doesn't show up on either of the surveillance cameras.
The footage shows a vehicle pulling up and the driver interacting with Odell Adams and his friends.
Hey, bro, how you doing, man? You ain't see us out here? Yes, but you got options. I'm trying to roll over. See this guy?
The north-facing camera captures the driver of the car parking and going into the bar.
Oh, come on, man. Get out there. Go someplace with that, bro. Okay. All right. See you, Odell.
And Adams walking away out of frame. Seconds later, an obscured figure emerges and fires gunshots in the direction of the parked cars. And a man who would become an eyewitness.
He was just a normal guy walking home, coming home from work. And he was within about 15 feet or so of the shooter when the shots got fired.
Did you see who shot at you?
I did not. They were, I don't know, a little ways down.
He didn't see the shooter's face, but could describe what he was wearing.
Black pants, black hoodie, white shoes.
But because Odell walked out of the security camera range just before the shooting started, police target him as the suspect.
That's how the initial police theory began.
Investigators put Adams under surveillance.
So I was being followed for a whole month that I didn't even know I was being followed.
He was targeted, even though the clothes he was wearing didn't match the witness's description.
Like I said, black hoodie, black pants, white shoes.
Okay.
And what Odell was wearing is a camouflage jacket that was a button-down jacket and was open. Matching camouflage pants, a white baseball hat, and a big white T-shirt underneath the jacket. And the jacket was open at all times.
Okay, and who did this? Was he white, black, Asian, or Hispanic?
I could not tell.
The witness couldn't determine the shooter's race because his hood was up, obscuring his face. Unlike Odell, who was wearing a baseball cap.
The idea that you can't see somebody's facial details because there's a hood covering the face is much different than a baseball hat.
4 a.m. on November 2nd, Portland's Tactical Operations Division pulls up at Odell Adams' mother's house. Lights flashing and bullhorns blaring, they set off flash grenades in the front and backyards.
I thought I was dreaming at first, actually, when I heard this big bomb. So then I hear them outside saying, "Come out with your hands up."
Odell and his family were still reeling from the loss of their mother just 5 days earlier.
We're planning for her funeral. So he picked out her earrings. We all found something to dress her in.
In their search of the house, police find 2 .40 caliber handguns in an attic crawl space and ammunition in a downstairs dresser.
I kind of thought, like, thank God she's not here because of the cancer and because she was so sick. And so thank God that we didn't have it. She didn't have a effing SWAT team busting her door while she's sick in bed. So that's what I was thinking about, like, we gotta keep moving because we gotta bury our mom.
Odell Adams was arrested, but he had no idea why.
I didn't know what it was for until later on when I got booked in jail for it.
He spent the day of his mother's funeral in jail.
He depended on her emotionally, financially, so, all of it, and it's his mom. For him not to be able to attend her funeral was very difficult.
When tested, only one of the 2 guns found at the home has Adams' DNA, along with DNA from 3 other people.
If you can create that link, you can link the firearm to the shooting, you can link Odell's DNA to the firearm, and you can combine that with the surveillance video that appears to show Odell walking off one screen, then onto the next screen and firing all of the shots. From the prosecution standpoint, you have a pretty clear-cut case.
To build that case, investigators send the gun with the DNA to a firearms examiner for analysis. Firearms examiners study the bullets, cartridge casings, and guns collected as evidence.
And so we would call these as impressed marks that we see on the breech face. So a breech face impression, that's what we're going to use to do our identification.
When a gun is loaded, what you think of as the bullet is technically called the cartridge. When a gun is fired, the bullet is often lost, but the cartridge casing that held the bullet is kicked out of the side of the gun.
So the premise of firearms examination is to examine these cartridge cases. The way they interact, how that cartridge, when it's fired, interacts with the firearm, results in the transfer of markings from the firearm to the cartridge case.
Keith Morris is a professor of forensic and investigative science at West Virginia University. The theory behind firearms analysis is that no 2 guns are exactly identical, and that every gun imprints a unique set of marks onto the ammunition it fires. Investigators use those marks to match a cartridge casing to a specific gun.
So the typical approach would be if, for instance, we get cartridge cases from a crime scene, and then at some point a detective might come across a suspect who may have a firearm, then the firearm would be provided and we would make test fires from that particular firearm.
Then the test-fired cartridges are compared to those from the crime scene, using a comparison microscope with 2 stages, one for each cartridge. If the marks on the cartridges are similar enough, they are called an identification, or in other words, a match.
So that's kind of the measure of the similarity, the way in which a source determination is made. So this could say then that this cartridge case was fired by this particular firearm or it was not.
The discipline of firearms analysis got its start in a high-profile criminal case. On February 14, 1929, a gang of Chicago gangsters led by Bugs Moran was waiting for a shipment of Canadian whiskey when they were gunned down by men dressed as police officers. It would become known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 70 shells were recovered at the crime scene. More than 40 bullets and fragments were extracted from the victims.
There was a group in Chicago that did work on the scientific investigation of crime, and they worked on the Valentine Day Massacre, and one of the leaders would be Calvin Goddard.
Dr. Calvin Goddard was an Army colonel and forensics pioneer. He had recently overseen the invention of a consequential piece of technology.
They developed the comparison microscope, which is still the main system which is used by firearms examiners today to do comparison.
When police discovered a cache of Thompson submachine guns belonging to an associate of Al Capone's, Goddard declared them a match to the casings and bullets from the scene of the massacre. The high-profile case lent credibility to the burgeoning discipline. Goddard went on to lead his field, coining the term forensic ballistics, training police departments, and advising the FBI on the establishment of their crime lab. Today, there is more than a century of precedent for firearms examination evidence being admitted at trial.
Firearms and tool marks is probably one of the most common pieces of evidence in the United States.
Julia Layton is the former general counsel for the Public Defender's Service in Washington, D.C.
It impacts a large number of cases, and typically cases that carry serious penalties.
Lawyers and judges place a premium on precedent.
Nicholas Skurich is a professor of psychology and criminality at the University of California, Irvine.
It's not surprising that, they're kind of wedded to this type of evidence coming in at trial.
But is it just legal tradition, or is there actual science to firearms analysis?
When I started as a public defender in D.C., it was just generally assumed that there was a scientific foundation to these disciplines and that there were procedures in place to ensure that they were reliable. We weren't challenging the evidence. We weren't even looking very closely at the evidence. That sort of changed with the introduction of DNA forensic evidence.
DNA was so new, legal precedent had yet to be set.
So it was an open question. And for us to be effective lawyers, we had to understand the evidence, understand the development of the technology so that we could effectively represent our clients in whether or not it should be admitted, and if so, under what circumstances and with what limitations.
Learning about DNA prompted Layton to question the science behind other types of evidence that bore the label forensic, including forensic firearms identification.
DNA evidence came out of the university and academic community. Firearms and tool marks, that's a discipline that essentially came out of crime labs in the early 1900s. It's not something that the larger scientific community has had any reason to pay any attention to. We have databases in the DNA world that tell us what the frequency of various features are, so we have a sense of their rarity. Are there databases that show us the frequency with which you see certain features? And as it turns out, there aren't.
Firearms analysis isn't the only forensic discipline without true scientific underpinnings.
Aside from that sort of straightforward DNA analysis, much of the other forensic evidence that we're using in courts today simply hasn't been validated.
Menka Sinha directs the Criminal Defense Clinic at the University of Maryland's Carey School of Law and researches the intersection of forensics and law.
In 2009, the National Academies of Sciences issued this sweeping report after an exhaustive 2-year investigation of forensic disciplines. So the report's goal was really to improve the forensic system.
It was a very impressive set of expertise in this committee, and their report was really damning. It was like, finally, somebody's opened Pandora's box about how little research, how little foundational, empirical, scientifically valid research has been done. And we thought we were going to go forth and have a sea change.
But the report was long and packed with science judges didn't have time for.
In one instance, the judge remarked, well, you can admit it into evidence, but I don't have time to read it.
Change didn't come, and among judges, there was little accountability.
Judges know they can trust the Court of Appeals to affirm whatever they do in this area.
Nancy Gertner is a former U.S. federal judge.
What people forget is that judges are human beings subject to the same kind of cognitive pressures that other people are. The judge will say, well, I'll err on the side of let the jury decide. That way it won't be error. That way I won't be making a mistake. That way the acquittal in this case of the hung jury won't be on me.
Precedent around firearms evidence continued to rule. But 10 years after the report was published, in 2019, a Washington, D.C. murder trial challenged the status quo. On a November afternoon in 2016, Orlando Silver was shot to death in Southeast Washington. His business associate, a 24-year-old marijuana dealer named Marquette Tibbs, was arrested for the crime. A police officer saw a man who looked like Tibbs run from the scene and toss a gun in a wooded area. They recovered the gun, a forensic examiner test-fired it and compared that cartridge with those recovered from the scene. Their conclusion: the gun and the casings from the scene were a match. In a pre-trial hearing, Tibbs' public defenders argued that there is no scientific basis for claiming a precise match, and therefore the judge shouldn't allow that testimony. In courtroom disputes like this one, many judges leave it to the jury to figure out what's real science and what's junk. They do this despite a 1993 ruling from the nation's highest court.
The Supreme Court has told us judges that you're supposed to be the gatekeeper. You're supposed to see if the evidence meets a certain threshold.
Judges had to look at the underlying methods and principles for scientific evidence that's being offered in court.
At San Francisco's UC Hastings Law School, Chancellor and Dean David Fegman specializes in the use of scientific research and legal decision-making.
So what happened in the early 90s is courts started looking at what the data actually were, what the methods that were being used, and they realized that there wasn't much there. And the forensic scientists basically said, well, we don't have data, we don't have studies, but we know we can do it because we've been doing it for 25 years, so trust us. And judges said, you have to tell us the statistics, you have to give us the research studies.
This is critical, in part, because juries find scientific evidence to be distinctly convincing.
One of the baseline problems with forensics, and in particular unreliable forensics, is that people think of it as highly scientific, and as a result, they place great weight on it.
But more often than not, judges don't follow the Supreme Court ruling.
Many of us became lawyers and judges precisely because we really were bad at math and really didn't want to be scientists. So there is certainly a certain reticence to engage in this, but judges have to deal with stuff all the time that they didn't know personally. What's shocking is, it's not fancy science that you're talking about. It really is quite straightforward.
By the time of the Tibbs case, firearms analysts had research studies they said could back up the validity and reliability of their methods. Nicholas Skurich has analyzed dozens of these studies and testified about his findings at the Tibbs pre-trial hearing.
Well, there are a lot of problems with these studies.
In many of these studies, participants were sent 2 groups of spent cartridges and asked to sort them into matched pairs.
Now, from a pure scientific standpoint, that's not a very good study design, in the sense that they're able to exploit this design to increase their accuracy.
Basically, the process of elimination could help them get more correct answers. In 2014, Ames Lab at Iowa State University solved that problem with another study.
Participants were given a coin envelope with 2 cartridge cases, and they were simply asked, do these cases match or not? And then they're given another coin envelope, and they're asked, do these cartridge cases match or not? So it's a much cleaner test.
But this one had its own issues.
What jumped out at me was an enormous amount of inconclusive responses.
In addition to marking identification for a match or elimination for a non-match, participants could choose a third option, inconclusive. And 20% of participants responded inconclusive for every single comparison.
So this wasn't, a few of them are inconclusive or not. This was every single response was inconclusive. And the study counted those responses as correct responses.
But the casings and bullets in the study were designed to match or not match.
There are only 2 answers to the question, identification or exclusion. So in my view, if you say, I don't know, that's not a correct answer.
Imagine taking the SAT exam, and one of the possible answers is, I don't know. And that answer is treated as correct.
Counting inconclusives as correct made the examiners seem very accurate. But count inconclusives as incorrect, and it's a whole different story.
The error rate goes from under 1% to about 33%.
Despite this major flaw, the study was held up as proof that firearms identification is scientifically valid. Yet a third study set out to prove reliability. Participants were mailed sets of cartridge casings to examine. What they didn't know was that they got the same sets twice.
So they're looking at the same bullets or cartridge cases that they've already looked at.
If their analysis was reliable, they should reach the same conclusions both times. But that didn't happen.
The examiners were reaching the same conclusion about 65% of the time. And importantly, this doesn't mean they reached the correct conclusion 65% of the time. It only means they reached the same conclusion 65% of the time.
So inconsistent results a third of the time.
And so this is an incredible indictment, and maybe why the Ames 2 research is no longer easily found on their website.
Though they are widely used to support firearms analysis, none of the studies have ever been published in an independent, peer-reviewed scientific journal. For this reason, and despite decades of precedent, the judge in Marquette Tibbs' trial refused to allow a firearms examiner to testify that the cartridge from the crime scene was a match to the gun. And Tibbs, who maintained his innocence, was found not guilty of murder.
That's why the Tibbs case is so important. The published opinion got everybody's attention.
Meanwhile, Odell Adams spends 2 years in jail since his arrest in 2018, awaiting trial for an incident in which an eyewitness described a different culprit, a shooting where no one was even injured. His losses were only mounting.
I was like, I lost everything. I lost my apartment, I lost my job, I lost going to see my mother being buried, and just a whole lot of stuff was just like heavy on me during that time.
Then COVID hit.
I'm not sentenced to death. I could have like caught COVID and died. We're like housed up in these dorms and stuff, and it's not no safety things going on.
Adams' case hinges on firearms analysis, specifically whether casings found outside the Speakeasy Lounge match those test-fired by the gun found at his mother's house. The first computerized analysis says no match. The Speakeasy evidence was not created by the gun.
When that initial test was run in Odell's case, the answer that was given was that there was no match. So at that point in the investigation, the investigators assumed that there wasn't a match.
But instead of dropping the case, they rerun the test.
The computer gives a different result at this point. At this point, the computer says that they actually do match.
I was feeling like they wasn't satisfied with the result. Now, like, I feel like it was more of them trying to force something.
As often occurs in firearms analysis, the computer test is followed by a comparison performed by a human examiner. Using a comparison microscope, he determines that all the cartridges found at the Speakeasy Lounge had been fired by the gun from Odell's mother's attic. The federal prosecutors had their case ready for trial. After 2 years of waiting in jail, Adams was offered a plea deal.
I think that is designed to break you down, so you will get out and just take some probation or take some time and go home to put it behind you. A lot of people does that, you know what I'm saying? Because they have family and they have kids, like responsibility, jobs and stuff.
But Odell is not a lot of people.
I was like, no way. I'm not accepting something that I didn't do.
Like in the Tibbs case, the judge holds a pretrial hearing about the firearms evidence. Odell's lawyers argue that it is inherently subjective and unreliable.
What they were doing wasn't scientific. that the only thing that they were doing is they were looking at those really close under the microscope, changing the lighting, and then deciding whether they matched or not.
Over the course of 4 hearings, the prosecution's analyst struggles to articulate an objective basis or methodology for his exam process. Instead, the court hears a familiar argument.
What you're left with is a firearm examiner who has done this thousands of times and testified in hundreds of cases, getting up there and saying, based on all of this experience, I'm right, and you should trust me.
You can trust me based on my training and experience.
We know we can do it because we've been doing it for 25 years, so trust us.
And as in the Tibbs case, the judge agrees with the defense. He will only allow factual observations that the caliber of the gun matches the caliber of the casings at trial. The examiner is not allowed to testify that the casings matched the specific gun. In October of 2020, the jury finds Adams not guilty.
I felt like justice has been served.
For the second time in a year, the science of firearms analysis has been successfully challenged. Despite an impressive century of precedent, its scientific underpinnings don't seem to hold up to scrutiny.
What most people don't realize is that outside of DNA analysis, most forensic methods, they weren't developed in scientific labs. They were developed by and for law enforcement.
Modern forensic science, 400 public crime labs across the U.S., countless private contractors, was launched by a massive influx of federal funding in the late 1960s, when social upheaval led Lyndon Johnson to declare a war on crime.
And very quickly, the war on crime evolves into the war on drugs, which everyone is much more familiar with, and recognizes as a driving force of the mass criminalization that's been occurring for the last, 50-ish years.
Still today, the Department of Justice is the primary funder of forensic science development, including problematic validation studies.
You can't perceive of forensics as either a bubble or separate from or insulated from the carceral system. It's part and parcel of it.
What we've ultimately come to is a system in which the police and prosecutor identify who they believe is guilty of a charge. And then this whole machinery of the criminal justice system starts working on and then ultimately sentencing that person to prison time.
So they are developed as tools to help law enforcement pursue law enforcement functions, meaning surveillance, investigation, prosecution, securing convictions, and sometimes even at sentencing to secure a higher punishment.
Because of the vast number of guns in the United States, firearms analysis is a singularly effective tool with some devastating results. In 1985, a series of violent robberies shook Birmingham, Alabama. 2 fast food managers were shot and killed. A third survived his wounds. Police made a photo lineup that included an old mugshot of 29-year-old Anthony Ray Hinton that they had on hand from a petty theft arrest years earlier. The surviving fast food manager picked him out as the shooter.
My name is Anthony Ray Hinton. In 1985, it was the hottest day of July, it seems like, and I woke up that morning and didn't have a care in the world.
Police found Hinton mowing his mother's lawn in the heat of the July day.
I just happened to look up and there stood 2 white gentlemen that I never seen before. I cut the lawnmower off and I said, "Can I help you?" And one of them replied, "We're looking for Anthony Ray Hinton." And I said, "That would be me, how can I help you?" And they said, "We have a warrant for your arrest." And I said, "For what?" And one of them replied, "We'll tell you that later, but right now we want you to put your hands behind your back." I complied, I put my hands behind my back.
Hinton was handcuffed and put in a Birmingham police cruiser without an explanation.
I must have asked the detective at least 50 times, why am I being arrested? And finally, he said, you want to know why we arrested you? I said, yes. He said, we're going to charge you with first-degree robbery, first-degree kidnap, first-degree attempted murder. I said, but I haven't done any of that. You got the wrong person. He said, let me tell you something right now. I don't care whether you did it or didn't do it. He said, but I'm going to make sure you found guilty of it. I said, for a crime I didn't commit? He said, you must have a hearing problem. Didn't I tell you I don't care whether you did it or didn't do it?
Hinton's mother kept an old revolver for shooting snakes. Police seized it and turned it over to the state for examination.
If we're looking at something like firearms analysis, most people think, well, how could race be a factor? You're just looking at 2 bullets from a gun. But the examiner's not just looking at 2 bullets from a gun.
Janice Pericall is the executive director of the Forensic Justice Project.
The examiner, before they ever look at those bullets, they look at a police report. And in that police report is the lead suspect's name and their race and a nice narrative about what the police officer thinks happened. All of that creates bias in the analysis.
They quickly concluded that the bullets from all 3 shootings matched Hinton's mother's gun. Hinton had no history of violent crime. On the night of one of the shootings, he had been 15 miles away at work, closely supervised in a locked warehouse. But just as the arresting officer promised, he was charged with the crimes.
And I sit in jail for a year and a half. Finally, I go before a judge, and he asked me, could I afford a lawyer, and I tell him no. He called his lawyer up front. First thing that lawyer said, he said, I did not go to law school to do pro bono work. I said, sir, would it make a difference to you if I told you I was innocent? That lawyer looked at me for the first time, and he said, the problem with that statement, all of y'all is always doing something, and the moment you get caught, you say you didn't do it.
Based on the firearms evidence, Hinton was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree capital murder.
On December 17, 1986, I went to Alabama death row, where I would remain for the next 30 years of my life.
For the first 3 of those years, he refused to speak.
The guard asked me my name, and I would write it down. When my mother and my best friend Lester came to see me, I wouldn't talk to them. I just couldn't get over the anger.
His years in prison stretched into decades. Cases in which the new science of DNA proved the innocence of wrongfully convicted people started making news. But DNA isn't a magic bullet for firearms cases, because shooters rarely leave behind genetic material.
There are whole categories of crimes in which you'll never find DNA evidence. And many of those involve firearms.
For now, DNA can't help the Anthony Hintons out there. But in 2014, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the defense, mounted by Hinton's court-appointed attorney, the lawyer who didn't go to law school to do pro bono work, was constitutionally deficient. He was granted a new trial, and the judge dismissed the charges.
For the first time in 30 years, I heard the word, "You going home." And exactly at 9:30 on April the 3rd, 2015, I walked out the Jefferson County Jail for the first time to freedom. And it was like bittersweet, for I had wanted my mother to be there. And she just didn't survive that long.
Without the erroneous firearms analysis evidence, Hinton would never have been convicted. Julia Layton feels that forensics should be treated like other industries where people's lives are on the line.
We should be treating it as a high-risk industry. We should be regulating it, we should be investing in it, and we should be overseeing it, just as we would medicine and aviation.
But that isn't happening.
And I fear it is largely because the vast majority of people caught up in the criminal justice system are people that are poor and people of color.
The system seems broken, but legal advocates say it's just the opposite.
It's operating in ways that it was designed to in the first place. This was designed to be this punitive system.
Without oversight, subjective forensic methods like firearms analysis can be used unfairly to develop evidence of guilt. Odell Adams learned that firsthand. When he was found not guilty of the shooting at the Speakeasy Lounge in federal court, he figured he'd be home in time for dinner.
My lawyers called me and said, ain't you supposed to be getting released and all this other stuff? And I was like waiting on it.
But they never let him go.
I stayed in custody after I got acquitted. I didn't understand that at all. I was like, this can't be happening, but it was. It was a shocker to me.
Typically, when the federal government takes over the case like that, what the state prosecutor will do is they will dismiss their case.
But not this time.
The state case never went away. It just sort of kept on setting over the dates in the state case to kind of leapfrog over the continuances that were being granted in the federal cases.
I never thought that I would have to go to trial twice for the same incident. Never in my life. I felt stuck. I felt alone.
Adams was stuck, and his fate would turn out to be driven by larger forces than he could imagine. In 2016, another government report had rocked the world of forensics. Issued by President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, an organization known as PCAST, it echoed the 2009 report.
And its findings are equally striking. It says, no, many of the things that we're using in court today continue to not have been validated.
And again, we thought, surely this is a watershed moment, because we now have a report that corroborates what the National Academy of Sciences found.
But law enforcement at the highest levels objected. U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch rejected the report on behalf of the U.S. Department of Justice. And the FBI issued a statement opposing many of PCAST's conclusions.
They were worried that what it would mean for these closed cases. Would they open back up? Would we have to relitigate all of this? And they were also worried about what it meant for open cases.
Just how worried became clear late in the Trump administration. In January 2021, the Department of Justice issued an unusual statement. It called out recent decisions in which judges ruled that firearms analysis evidence should be limited. Two of those cases were Marquette Tibbs and Odell Adams, both of whom had been found not guilty in 2020.
This is unsigned. It has no seal. It doesn't explain who did it, why they did it. This appears to be sort of an effort by lawyers that didn't like the court's rulings to try and put something out under DOJ's label saying there was something wrong with PCAST and there's something wrong with these court decisions.
Courts took action. While Marquette Tibbs had been tried in Washington, D.C., where there is no state court system to pursue him further, Adams was in Oregon. When he was found not guilty in federal court, the state moved quickly, doubling down.
What the state prosecutor did is take the case back to grand jury and make the case a lot more serious. They added an attempted murder charge and attempted assault 1 charge.
If found guilty of these new charges, Adams would face many years in prison.
The federal trial was intense as hell, and then he gets found not guilty, and then they pick it up again. So it felt like, no, the hell he didn't. That's what it felt like. It felt like, how dare, oh, hell no. It felt like almost like this good old boy system and not really about the crime.
So I felt like it was vindictiveness with the state.
For a second time, Adams was offered a plea.
We're saying, we just want you home, and you're saying, I didn't do it, and I'm not gonna admit to something that I did not do.
And for a second time, he maintained his innocence.
You had Odo Adams from day one saying, I want my trial. If you think I did this, come into court and prove it.
Adams' state defense team, which included John Robb, took the same approach as his federal trial.
We filed all the same motions, including the motion to exclude, the tool mark examiner coming in and at the motion phase argued to the judge, Judge, this is not scientifically valid. The state has not met their burden to show that this is actually reliable.
State prosecutors brought 2 new firearms examiners to the pretrial hearing. One of them claimed his personal error rate was 0. Both sides made all the same arguments, but with a different outcome.
The judge ultimately decided, we'll just let the jury decide it.
Letting the jury decide is not what the Supreme Court ruled should happen.
The jurors are not scientists. They don't understand all these big languages and all this stuff. And all they do is watch forensic science and all that stuff on these TV shows, and they think, oh, well, if this person said it, then it has to be this. They don't know.
At trial, the 2 firearms examiners, each with an impressive resume, declared the cartridges collected at the scene a match to the gun found at Odell's mother's house. They also openly acknowledged that they were there in part as a response to the precedent set at Adams' federal trial.
As firearms and tool marks examiners, we follow admissibility hearings across the country. Anytime that there is a ruling specifically about the science, we always want to go back and see why a certain ruling was made.
They claimed the issue was not a lack of science, but a poor explanation.
In this case, it was an insufficient testimony from the analyst to explain the actual science.
It sounded so shady the second time around, honestly, like the stuff that they were presenting.
Aside from the firearms evidence, the state trial was a repeat of the federal trial. The same arguments were made, the same evidence was presented, right down to the eyewitness who called 911 and described the shooter dressed differently than Odell Adams.
Black pants, black hoodie, white shoes.
He really wants this guy caught, and steadfastly, over multiple years, describes somebody who was wearing completely different clothes.
Unlike in the federal trial, this time there were no black jurors, which Odell felt was a disadvantage.
When they say a jury of your peers, is people that's living in the same area that you're living in and seeing the same things that you're seeing, not people that live up in the hills that watch shows and movies and all this stuff, and they stereotype you. I got tattoos, I got braids, and I fit the description of being guilty behind that alone.
The jury did indeed find him guilty on 2 counts, criminal mischief and unlawful use of a weapon. He was acquitted of attempted murder. By the time of the verdict, he had been in jail for 3 years, waiting for his trials. At his sentencing, Adams spoke in court for the first time.
I have been going through this for 3 years, and I haven't even been able to mourn my mother's death. I was put in this box, man, and I still feel like I'm in this box, and the walls are steady closing on me. It's not what the big picture is painted here upon me. It's like I'm just this bad person, which I'm not. It's been barriers that I had to climb over, and I'm steady climbing. Whatever happens today, it happens. I have been getting the bad end of the stick all my life. Like, how much more do a person has to take?
What I loved is that he kind of said, like, this is what has happened. This is what you guys have taken from me. I haven't had a chance to process my mother's death. You know, yeah, I did a lot of stuff as a kid. How long is that gonna follow me? You know, and when are you gonna see me as trying to do something different? I was proud that he, finally had a voice.
Odell had to spend 2 more years in prison, on top of the 3 he had already served. He was finally released in December 2021, in time to see family at Christmas. And for the first time, he was able to visit his mother's grave.
I know she's like looking down on me and knowing that she is proud of me, period.
His journey through the legal system represents both the past and the future. His state trial is rooted in a century of legal precedent established for firearms analysis evidence. His federal case represents the prospect for change in how that evidence is treated moving forward. Whether it's change the judicial system will accept remains to be seen. Odell Adams is appealing his conviction.
I pick myself up and keep going, you know what I'm saying? Straight up.
But if he succeeds in winning a new trial, there's a chance it could end with an even harsher sentence.
I appealed because this is not right. I didn't do this. I'm innocent. I don't fit the description. This is not right. I have been accepting a lot of things, and it's a time where you just get fed up. So that's why I appeal. And if I have to appeal again, I will appeal, and I will keep appealing. I will keep appealing. The ballistic thing is not valid. It's not no scientific proof of anything. It's like when you are fighting the whole United States by yourself, it's kind of hard. It's hard.